It is a cold morning in late November 1990, the kind where breath hangs visible in the air and frost clings stubbornly to windshields across the southeast suburbs of London. In a quiet parking lot in Reigate, Surrey, just beyond the sprawl of the capital, a Securicor armoured security van is making its routine cash collections from local businesses. The guards inside have done this route dozens of times. They know the stops, the timing, the protocols. What they do not know is that two figures in dark boiler suits and grotesque rubber Ronald Reagan masks have been watching them, tracking their movements for weeks. These men approach the van with unnerving calm, each carrying sawn-off shotguns concealed beneath their clothing until the final moment. They have done this sort of thing before, many times in fact, and their confidence shows in every measured step. Inside the van, the guards are still unaware of the danger creeping toward them across the cold asphalt. In seconds, the masked gunmen spring into action with practiced efficiency. One slams a sledgehammer against the van's reinforced windshield, cracking it with a thunderous blow that echoes across the empty lot, while the other raises his shotgun and yells for the guards to surrender, his voice muffled but unmistakably threatening through the mask. It looks like another seamless armed robbery by one of London's most audacious criminal gangs, the kind of operation that has become their signature across the capital. But today, fate has different plans. From the periphery of the parking lot, shouts erupt, clear, authoritative, terrifying to the would-be robbers. Armed police, more than a dozen officers who have been lying in wait for hours in unmarked vehicles and concealed positions, reveal themselves in a coordinated sweep. The would-be robbers spin in surprise, their masks swiveling as they try to assess their suddenly collapsing situation. A flurry of gunshots shatters the cold morning air, the sound ricocheting off the surrounding buildings in overlapping waves. In the chaos, one of the masked assailants, a gang associate named Kenneth Baker, lifts his shotgun instinctively to fire at the approaching officers, but he is instantly cut down by police bullets before he can pull the trigger. He crumples to the ground, fatally wounded, his blood pooling on the frost-touched pavement. The driver of the gang's getaway pickup truck, a man named Mehmet Arif, tries desperately to ram his way out of the encirclement, accelerating toward a gap in the police cordon, but a police marksman's bullet finds him through the windscreen, striking him squarely in the chest. Mehmet slumps over the steering wheel, badly injured but alive, the truck rolling to a stop against a concrete barrier. The second masked robber, Mehmet's brother, Dennis Arif, drops his weapon and raises his hands, but finds himself tackled hard to the concrete by several officers who have been waiting for exactly this moment. The entire showdown is over within moments, less than 2 minutes from the first hammer blow to the final arrest. As the police secure the scene with practiced efficiency, cordoning off the area and calling for medical assistance, they pull the grotesque Reagan masks off the captives to reveal two of South London's most notorious underworld figures, Mehmet and Dennis Arif. The brothers, key operational members of the infamous Arif Crime Family, are finally in handcuffs, blood-spattered and defeated. For over a decade, their family's name had been whispered in back rooms and pub corners across London, synonymous with fear, violence, and what seemed like untouchable power in the criminal underworld. Now in this parking lot turned battleground, the law has struck a rare and resounding blow against them, the culmination of months of patient surveillance and intelligence gathering. This botched robbery and shootout marks a turning point in the story of the Arif family, but it is not the beginning, nor is it quite the end. Before we go deeper into this chilling true story, subscribe if you love real crime documentaries like this one, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single one. To understand how these men became bold enough to attempt a daylight cash van heist and why police were so ready for them, we must journey back through the shadowy rise of the Arif crime family, back to the streets of South London decades earlier, to a time when Britain's underworld was in flux and opportunity existed for those ruthless enough to seize it. The story of the Arifs begins in the 1960s in the working-class districts of South London, in neighborhoods that rarely made headlines except when something went wrong. The family, of Turkish-Cypriot origin, had settled in Britain by the mid-20th century, part of a larger wave of immigration from the eastern Mediterranean following Cyprus's independence and subsequent conflicts. They planted roots in areas like Rotherhithe, Peckham, and along the Old Kent Road, neighborhoods characterized by council estates, industrial decline, and limited economic prospects for immigrant families. They were a large family by any measure, by some counts 7 brothers along with several sisters, and an extended network of cousins, uncles, and in-laws who would later feature in various capacities in the family's criminal enterprises. Life for immigrant families in those days was hard, marked by cultural isolation, discrimination, and scarce legitimate opportunity for advancement. The Arif brothers found their opportunity not in conventional trades or education, but in the shadowy corners of the city's underworld, where ethnicity mattered less than toughness and intelligence mattered less than ruthlessness. As teenagers and young men in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Arif brothers started off with the typical street hustles of the era. They ran with local gangs, engaged in petty theft from shops and warehouses, participated in street fights that established territorial dominance, and occasionally pulled off burglaries that brought in modest sums. In those years, South London's criminal landscape was in a state of flux. The era of the Cray twins in East London and the Richardson gang in South London, once the undisputed kings of London as organised crime, was ending in spectacular fashion with high-profile trials and long prison sentences. This left a power vacuum that ambitious young criminals across the capital recognized as an opening. The Arif brothers, street-smart and fearless, sensed this opportunity. They were determined to climb the criminal ladder, and crucially, they had the family cohesion and willingness to use extreme violence that would prove essential to their rise. By the 1970s, the Arifs had graduated to more serious crimes, the kind that could sustain an underworld empire rather than just provide pocket money. They learned the rackets that formed the backbone of organized crime, extortion of local businesses, protection schemes where shopkeepers and pub owners paid regular fees to avoid having their establishments damaged or themselves hurt, and increasingly sophisticated armed robberies targeting security vans, banks, and post offices. Even in these early years, a reputation for extreme brutality began to form around the family, a reputation they cultivated deliberately as a business tool. People who crossed the Arifs or refused to pay what was demanded of them would be made examples of in ways designed to spread fear through the community. One notorious anecdote that circulated in underworld circles, and later in police files, involved the eldest brother, Dogan Arif, who would eventually be regarded as the family's godfather. It was said that Dogan had a chilling way of making introductions during shakedowns of business owners who were reluctant to pay protection money. He would jam the barrel of his handgun into a victim's mouth mid-conversation, forcing them to feel the cold metal against their teeth, while he explained, very calmly, what would happen if payment was not forthcoming. The threat needed no translation, no elaboration. This was how the Arifs operated, through raw personal intimidation, enforced not by hired muscle, but by the brothers themselves, creating a mystique of invincibility. The first time the Arif name truly surfaced in the British press and in serious police investigations was in May 1977, when a security van robbery in South London turned deadly in a way that shocked even hardened detectives. Early one morning, a Securicorps van carrying substantial cash was attacked by a gang of armed men in a carefully planned ambush. The robbers, wearing masks and moving with military-style coordination, smashed the armored windshield with a sledgehammer, a technique that would become their signature, and sprayed the interior with shotgun blasts, forcing the terrified guards to surrender their cargo. In the violent frenzy, one security guard was shot and killed, his death transforming what might have been treated as a serious robbery into a murder investigation with significant resources. The robbers escaped with the cash, leaving police scrambling for clues in an era before widespread CCTV surveillance or mobile phone tracking. In the investigation that followed, lasting months and involving multiple police units, an Arif brother was eventually linked to the heist through witness statements and forensic evidence. Osar Arif, one of the younger siblings, was arrested and charged with the guard's murder, a charge that carried a mandatory life sentence. It was a sensational case in the local press, a young man from an immigrant family standing accused of a cold-blooded killing during a major robbery, with prosecutors painting a picture of a ruthless new breed of criminal. However, The trial resulted in a stunning outcome that would set a pattern for years to come. Osar Arif was acquitted of the murder charge. The prosecution, despite months of preparation, could not make the charges stick definitively, possibly due to lack of concrete forensic evidence linking him directly to the fatal shot, witnesses too frightened to testify clearly, or effective defense lawyering that created reasonable doubt. Another Arif brother, Bekir, known within the family as the Duke, was convicted on a lesser charge related to the robbery, specifically disposing of the firearms used in the crime, and served approximately 5 years in prison. But for the most part, the family walked away from the 1977 incident with minimal consequences relative to the severity of the crime. For the Arifs, this outcome was instructive. They learned that even serious charges could be beaten with the right combination of fear-induced silence from witnesses and skilled legal representation. That close call, rather than deterring them, only bolstered the Arifs' daring and confirmed their belief that they could operate with relative impunity. By the early 1980s, the brothers had firmly established themselves in the South London underworld hierarchy. They were no longer just street thugs scraping by on petty crimes. They were evolving into sophisticated criminals with diversified income streams and increasing territorial control. With substantial earnings from robberies and extortion flowing in regularly, they began investing strategically in ostensibly legitimate enterprises, a classic organized crime strategy. The Arifs acquired pubs, nightclubs, and properties throughout their territory, purchases made through front companies and relatives with clean records. These businesses served a dual purpose in their criminal ecosystem. First, they provided effective mechanisms for laundering the dirty money generated by robberies and drug deals, transforming traceable cash into legitimate business income that appeared on tax returns. Second, and equally important, they acted as physical strongholds for their operations and demonstrations of their power. A pub under Arif control might host covert meetings among gangsters in a private back room where police informants dared not venture. Or a nightclub they operated could double as a marketplace for drugs flowing through their distribution network, with bouncers who were actually enforcers ensuring smooth operations. During this era of expansion in the 1980s, the Arifs were one of a handful of dominant crime families operating in London, each with defined territories and specializations. Another major power was the Adams family syndicate, led by the Adams brothers in North London, who controlled significant portions of the drug trade and armed robbery networks north of the Thames. Fortunately for both organizations, and for London generally, a direct turf war between them never materialized. By most accounts from police intelligence and underworld sources, the Arifs and the Adams clan maintained a pragmatic peace, even cooperating at times on certain ventures to avoid mutual destruction. They tacitly respected each other's zones of influence, the Arifs largely south of the River Thames, the Adams family to the north, both sides understanding that open conflict would only attract overwhelming police attention and jeopardize the lucrative drug and racketeering markets from which both profited handsomely. They were not without competition from other quarters, however. Other Turkish and Kurdish syndicates, such as the infamous Bay Basin cartel, were also active in smuggling heroin into Britain through established routes from Turkey. The Bay Basins, operating from both Turkey and London, controlled significant portions of the European heroin trade. However, the Arifs leveraged a potent combination of negotiation, intimidation, and selective violence to maintain a strong hold on London's share of the trade, ensuring that rivals found little foothold in their city without paying tribute or facing consequences. By the end of the 1980s, the Arif crime family had reached a zenith of power that few criminal organizations in Britain had achieved. The brothers had become one of the most feared gangs in the entire capital, especially in the southeast boroughs they called home. Residents in neighborhoods like Peckham Bermondsey and Camberwell understood implicitly that certain clubs, cafes, or pubs were effectively Arif territory, and that any trouble in those spots could invite a visit from hard-faced enforcers ready to dole out punishment that ranged from severe beatings to worse. The Metropolitan Police were well aware of the Arifs' growing influence, but they struggled to infiltrate their ranks or gather the kind of evidence that would secure convictions. The family was clannish and deeply insular, operating on principles of ethnic and familial loyalty that made penetration by undercover officers or recruitment of informants exceedingly difficult. They trusted only each other and a carefully vetted circle of close associates, many sharing their Turkish-Cypriot background and cultural ties. This closed nature, combined with a well-earned reputation for violent retaliation against informants, made it extraordinarily difficult for law enforcement to get near the inner circle or gather the testimony needed for prosecution. Crucially, around this same time, a new illicit opportunity was exploding that would transform the Arifs from merely wealthy criminals into truly powerful, organized crime figures. That opportunity was narcotics, specifically heroin. The late 1970s and 1980s saw heroin pour into Western Europe in unprecedented quantities, often routed from the poppy fields of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Turkey through what was known as the Balkan route. The Arifs, with their Turkish-Cypriot heritage and maintained connections to their homeland, were perfectly positioned geographically and culturally to capitalize on this deadly trade. Leveraging family connections in Turkey and contacts within the Turkish and Turkish-Cypriot communities abroad, the Arifs became key importers of high-grade heroin into London. They oversaw a sophisticated pipeline that brought the drug from suppliers overseas, often through complex routes involving multiple countries to obscure the trail, straight into the veins of London's growing population of heroin addicts. The profits from narcotics completely dwarf those from even the most successful armed robberies. A single successful heroin importation could net the family more money than a dozen security van heists, with lower immediate risk of police confrontation. They reinvested these enormous profits strategically into more drugs to expand operations, into bribes that greased the wheels to keep their operation running smoothly by corrupting port officials or customs officers, and into their legitimate business fronts to further obscure the money trail. By the end of the 1980s, the Arif family was flush with cash and confidence. They had become, as some law enforcement officials would later call them, with grudging acknowledgement, Britain's most powerful crime family of that era, at least in terms of operational scope and ruthlessness. Yet despite their infamy in the underworld and their presence in police intelligence files, the Arifs themselves remained largely ghosts to the public at large. They weren't splashed across newspaper front pages in the way the Cray twins had been, nor did they cultivate celebrity personas or court journalists for favorable coverage. They moved quietly, preferring genuine influence over public notoriety. Their power was felt in hushed threats delivered in backrooms, in protection payments made in cash-filled envelopes, and in secret deals with drug suppliers, not in public swagger or media appearances. That deliberate secrecy served them well for many years, shielding them from the full glare of sustained law enforcement attention and allowing them to operate more freely than they might have otherwise. However, the Arifs' dominance was about to be challenged in a way they perhaps did not fully anticipate. The challenge would come not from law enforcement, at least not initially, but from fellow gangsters operating in the same South London neighborhoods, rivals who watched with growing envy and resentment as the Arifs grew rich and powerful, and who eventually decided that they too wanted a larger share of the criminal pie. Organized crime, after all, is seldom a peaceful enterprise, and as the Arifs grew stronger and more visible within the underworld, other groups inevitably began to see them as obstacles to be removed, or at minimum cut down to size. Among those rivals were two clans deeply rooted in South London's criminal milieu, the Brindle family and the Daly family. The Brindles, like the Arifs, were a tight-knit criminal family with multiple brothers involved in various rackets, including armed robbery, drug distribution, and extortion. The Dalys, closely allied with the Brindles through friendship and possibly distant kinship, operated similarly. Both families had established their own territories and operations, but these inevitably overlapped with Arif interests in the relatively confined geography of South London. For years, an uneasy coexistence had prevailed, with occasional friction but no open warfare. It was only a matter of time before their paths collided violently with the Arifs, setting off one of London's most notorious gangland feuds, a conflict that would claim multiple lives and dominate police attention throughout the early 1990s. The spark that ignited what would become known as the Arif-Brindle feud came in the summer of 1990, in an incident that seemed almost designed to provoke maximum outrage. On a warm August night, the Queen's Head pub in Walworth was winding down for the evening, with the last patrons finishing their drinks and the landlord John Daly chatting casually with regulars behind the bar. Without warning, a group of armed men stormed through the doors with military-style aggression. They headed straight for John Daly, who barely had time to register what was happening before one intruder pressed a pistol hard against his lips, the barrel forcing its way between his teeth in a gesture deliberately designed to terrify and humiliate. Other gang members brandished weapons at the stunned patrons, ordering them to remain still and silent. The gunman holding the pistol in Daly's mouth demanded money, protection payments, taxes for operating on what they claimed was their turf. It was a naked act of extortion, executed with the kind of theatrical brutality designed to leave a lasting psychological impression. These attackers were enforcers linked to the Brindle family, a rival South London gang with roots in the same geographic area the Arifs considered exclusively theirs. The Dalys, the family of the pub owner now quite literally staring down the barrel of a gun, had ties of friendship and possibly kinship with the Arifs that went back years. By targeting John Daly in this fashion, the Brindles were not merely attempting to collect protection money from a profitable pub. They were directly challenging the Arif's sphere of influence in the most provocative manner possible, demonstrating that they were willing to violate what had been understood boundaries. It was an unspoken rule of the underworld that certain businesses were under certain families' protection, and interfering with those arrangements was considered an act of war. The Brindles had just broken that rule deliberately and publicly. The humiliation of having a gun forced into his mouth in front of his patrons and staff was not something John Daly or the Arifs standing behind him would let pass without response. Word of the Queen's Head pub incident spread quickly through gangland networks, carried by witnesses and eventually by the victims themselves, seeking protection and revenge. The message from the Brindles was clear and intentional. We're coming for what's yours, we don't fear you, and we're prepared to use violence to stake our claim. The Arifs and their allies prepared to answer, and they would not wait long. In the underworld's brutal logic, such a direct challenge could not go unanswered without appearing weak, which would invite further encroachments. Barely a few weeks later, retaliation came swiftly and publicly. Late at night in September 1990, a popular South London nightclub was packed with dancers and revelers, the pulsating bass of house music drowning out conversation. The atmosphere was interrupted suddenly by gunfire, sharp cracks that cut through the music and sent panicked patrons screaming and diving for cover. Amidst the chaos of people fleeing in all directions and security trying to establish control, one man lay collapsed on the sticky nightclub floor, blood seeping through his club attire and pooling beneath him. He was Stephen Daligan, a known associate and close friend of the Brindle family, someone who had likely been present or involved in the planning of the Queen's Head incident. The shooter, witnesses later recounted to police, was a Turkish man who had been quietly stalking Daligan inside the club for some time, waiting for the right moment to strike. That man was Ahmed Abi Abdullah, a cousin of the Arif brothers, and one of their most trusted lieutenants, someone known for his willingness to carry out violent acts on the family's behalf. Abdullah had emptied his handgun into Daligan at near point-blank range, hitting him multiple times in the torso and limbs before slipping away in the confusion of the panicked crowd. Miraculously, Stephen Daligan survived despite being shot 7 times, though he was left with grievous life-altering wounds that required extensive surgery and rehabilitation. The attack on him was more than just an attempt at murder. It was a brazen statement of intent. The Arifs had answered the Queen's Head pub incident blow for blow, demonstrating that a member of the Brindle Circle could be targeted in a public venue and left for dead without consequence. London's underworld recognized immediately that a genuine feud had begun in earnest, one that would not be easily resolved. Both sides were now on high alert, members carrying weapons constantly and looking over their shoulders, knowing that the next attack could come at any moment. The feud escalated at a terrifying pace through late 1990 and early 1991, soon drawing blood on the Arif side as well in a way that would prove pivotal. On a chilly morning in March 1991, a William Hill betting shop on Walworth Road was conducting its usual business, with punters placing bets on horse races and football matches, studying racing forms and chatting with bookmakers. Without warning, shots rang out inside the busy shop, loud, echoing gunshots that sent customers diving behind counters and scrambling for the exit in terror. Amid the chaos of people fleeing for their lives, one man lay dying on the floor among scattered betting slips and overturned chairs. It was Ahmed Abi Abdullah, the same man who had shot Stephen Daligan just months earlier. The killers, two unidentified gunmen according to witness statements, had slipped into the betting shop, executed their target with clinical precision using handguns, and vanished into the streets of South London before anyone could mount an effective response or even get clear descriptions. Abdullah's lifeless body was left sprawled where he fell, discovered by the first police officers to arrive at the scene. The murder of Abi Abdullah sent profound shockwaves through the Arif family organization. He wasn't merely an associate or a paid enforcer. He was blood, Dogan Arif's own cousin, and a loyal soldier who had risked his life for the family. The brazenness of the hit, carried out in broad daylight in a public betting shop with witnesses present, signaled that the Brindles were equally determined to settle scores and were operating under the same logic of escalation. The message was unmistakable. If you kill ours, we will kill yours, and we will do it publicly to demonstrate our fearlessness. Almost immediately, police suspicion fell heavily on the Brindle brothers, particularly Anthony Tony Brindle and Patrick Brindle, who were regarded as the operational leaders of their family's criminal activities. They had clear motive, revenge for the shooting of their close associate Daligan, and they had demonstrated in previous actions that they possessed the audacity and resources to carry out such an attack. Within weeks of Abdullah's murder, Tony and Patrick Brindle were arrested and charged with his murder in what became a high-profile case that drew significant media attention. It was dramatic. Two of South London's most notorious gangster siblings standing trial at the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court, for executing a rival gang member in cold blood. The trial in 1992 was tense and closely watched, with heavy security due to fears of retaliation or witness intimidation. But in the end, the evidence presented by prosecutors wasn't sufficient to secure convictions. Key witnesses either disappeared before trial, claimed suddenly to recall nothing of value when under oath, or simply refused to testify despite subpoenas, almost certainly petrified of the violent retribution that testifying against the Brindles would invite. Lacking cooperative eyewitnesses to the shooting itself, and with no murder weapon recovered that could be conclusively linked to the defendants, the jury returned verdicts of not guilty on all charges. Tony and Patrick Brindle walked free from the Old Bailey, reportedly smirking at the outcome, their acquittal broadcast in news reports across London. To the Arifs and their supporters, the acquittal was perceived as a travesty of justice, proof in their minds that their enemy had literally gotten away with murder due to witness intimidation and gaps in the evidence. To the Brindles and their associates, it was a vindication and perhaps even an encouragement, a sign that they could strike at the Arifs with violence and potentially escape legal punishment due to the difficulties of securing convictions in gangland cases. Any fragile hope that Abdullah's slaying and the subsequent trial would conclude the tit-for-tat violence was completely shattered just a few months later, when the feud exploded again. In August 1991, violence struck with devastating force. This time the target was a dingy South London pub that served as a frequent hangout for members of the Brindle family, a place where they felt safe among friends and allies. David Brindle, the younger brother of Tony and Patrick, was having an evening drink at the Bell pub on East Street in Walworth, relaxing in what he considered his home turf. If David felt safe surrounded by familiar faces that evening, it proved to be a fatal miscalculation. As midnight approached and the pub's patrons were settling into their drinks, two men in balaclavas burst through the entrance, brandishing shotguns and moving with purpose toward their target. Without hesitation or warning, they opened fire on David Brindle, the shotgun blasts deafeningly loud in the confined space. David was hit multiple times by shotgun pellets at close range and died almost instantly, his body collapsing amid toppled chairs, shattered pint glasses, and the screams of terrified patrons. In the wild, indiscriminate spray of buckshot that followed in the chaotic seconds after the first shots, an innocent bystander named Stanley Silk a 47-year-old man who had simply been enjoying a quiet drink and had no connection whatsoever to any gang, was also struck and killed. Caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, a tragic casualty of a war he had nothing to do with. One of the gunmen, according to multiple witness accounts later given to police, was heard roaring a chilling declaration before fleeing the scene. "This is for Abi." The meaning could not have been clearer or more explicit. The Arifs had avenged their cousin Abdullah in the most direct, brutal way possible, by executing a member of the Brindle family in public, and doing so with a pronouncement that tied the act directly back to Abi Abdullah's murder. The double murder at the Bell pub took the feud to its grimmest, most deadly peak. In less than a year, the underworld war between these families had claimed multiple lives on both sides, along with innocent victims like Stanley Silk. South London neighbourhoods were gripped by a form of gangland terror reminiscent of the worst days of the Kray twins' reign. But this conflict was less predictable and more geographically dispersed. It could erupt anywhere, at any time, in a nightclub, a betting shop, a pub, and any bystander was at risk of becoming collateral damage in the crossfire. Scotland Yard, facing intense public pressure and media scrutiny, poured substantial resources into quelling the violence. The South East Regional Crime Squad, which specialized in organized crime investigations, coordinated closely with local police units to monitor known gang figures around the clock, hoping to preempt the next strike before it happened. Senior officers held strategy meetings to discuss how to break the cycle, knowing that without intervention, the revenge killings could continue indefinitely, each side feeling obligated to respond to the previous attack. They feared, quite rightly, that the cycle of vendetta would spiral completely out of control unless all sides were brought to justice or otherwise neutralized. Amid this climate of escalating violence and vendetta, one particularly dangerous figure loomed in police intelligence files, a man who might hold the key to understanding some of the bloodshed, but who remained as elusive as a ghost. His name was Jimmy Moody, and his story intersects with the Arif-Brindle feud in ways that remain partially mysterious even today. James. Moody was a notorious career criminal and suspected hitman, an underworld freelancer, with ties to various criminal factions across London. Moody had once run with the old-school London gangsters of the 1970s, participating in armed robberies and other violent crimes, but by the early 1990s, he was operating as something of a free agent in the criminal world. Most significantly for this story, Moody had been on the run from prison authorities since 1980, when he had escaped from custody while serving time for previous offenses. In the 11 years since his escape, he was believed by police to have committed multiple contract killings for different crime bosses across London. Always for a price, his services available to whoever could pay and could be trusted not to betray him. When David Brindle was gunned down at the Bell pub in August 1991, many people in both the underworld and within police intelligence units suspected Jimmy Moody as hand in the operation. Perhaps he was one of the masked triggermen who had burst into the pub that night. Perhaps he had orchestrated the hit from behind the scenes, providing planning and logistics. The execution had been professional, swift and deadly, hallmarks of someone experienced in such work. It was widely believed, though never conclusively proven in court, that the Arifs, determined to ensure their revenge was both swift and untraceable back to them personally, had hired Jimmy Moody to eliminate David Brindle as payback for Abi Abdullah's murder. Moody's reputation made him an ideal contractor for such work. He was experienced, ruthless, and being already a fugitive with nothing to lose, he had every reason to remain silent if caught. Definitive proof of Moody's involvement in David Brindle's murder never surfaced in any court proceeding, and he remained a fugitive, somehow evading one of Britain's most intensive manhunts. But if he was indeed the hitman or one of them, fate eventually caught up with him as well, in a manner that seemed almost inevitable given his lifestyle. In June 1993, roughly 2 years after the Bell pub shooting, Jimmy Moody was himself shot dead in an East London pub in what was presumed to be either a revenge hit, connected to one of his previous contract killings, or a dispute over underworld business dealings gone wrong. Thus ended the life of one of Gangland's most feared and mysterious killers, his death closing one shadowy chapter of the feud, while ensuring that whatever secrets he carried about the Arifs, the Brindles, and the various murders he may have committed went to the grave with him, never to be fully revealed. After the intense bloodshed of 1991, which had seen multiple murders and near-constant tension, a weary, tentative calm gradually settled over South London's criminal underworld. The Arif and Brindle families had both paid dearly in blood. Each clan had lost a brother or close family member to the violence. Both sides had members facing serious criminal charges, spending fortunes on legal representation or living as fugitives. The human and financial costs of the war were mounting to unsustainable levels. There were tentative signs emerging by 1992 that perhaps the worst was over, that exhaustion and self-preservation were finally overcoming the desire for continued revenge. Through 1992 and into 1993, overt violence between the groups subsided noticeably. There were no more public shootings in nightclubs or pubs, no more daylight executions in betting shops. Some observers and police analysts speculated that the gangs, under enormous pressure from both law enforcement surveillance and their own mounting losses, had reached some form of understanding or truce to halt the carnage before both families destroyed themselves entirely. Others within law enforcement believed the feud merely simmered beneath the surface in smaller, less visible skirmishes, perhaps beatings rather than murders. Perhaps economic warfare through interference with each other is criminal operations, and would inevitably flare up again when circumstances permitted or when someone decided the truce was no longer beneficial. That uneasy peace, whatever its true nature, was dramatically broken in 1995 by an audacious assassination attempt that could very well have reignited all-out war. Anthony "Tony" Brindle, who had been acquitted of Abi Abdullah's murder back in 1992 and had since become the de facto leader of the Brindle criminal organization, was very much a marked man. He moved cautiously through South London, constantly aware that the Arifs or their remaining allies might still seek vengeance for past acts. What Tony did not know, despite his precautions, was that an elaborate plan to kill him was already in motion, and it involved resources brought in from outside Britain specifically for this purpose. On the morning of September 20th, 1995, Tony Brindle stepped out of his house in Rotherhithe, preparing to go about his day's business, which likely involved meetings related to his various criminal enterprises. Unbeknownst to him, Metropolitan Police surveillance teams had been conducting a covert operation around his home for several weeks, having received credible intelligence of a serious threat to his life. They had learned through informants and intercepted communications that a contract killer had been hired and imported from Ireland, specifically to assassinate Tony as part of the still simmering gang dispute. That particular morning, the surveillance team, which included armed officers concealed in an unmarked utilities van, parked inconspicuously on Tony's street, was watching and waiting with growing tension. As Tony approached his parked car, apparently unaware of the danger, a man hiding inside a parked van directly across the road raised a shotgun and, without warning or hesitation, fired through the vehicle's windscreen. The blast, loaded with buckshot, caught Tony Brindle squarely in the stomach and legs, the impact dropping him immediately to the pavement in shock and agony, blood spreading rapidly across the concrete. In an instant, the quiet residential street erupted into absolute chaos. The undercover officers from the surveillance van sprang out, shouting warnings and aiming their firearms at the assailant, their cover completely blown, but their duty to prevent murder taking precedence. The gunman, a 49-year-old man from Dublin with no previous connection to British organised crime, climbed out of his van with the shotgun still in hand, apparently preparing either to finish his target with another shot or to shoot his way past the police. He never got the opportunity to do either. Police marksmen, authorized to use lethal force given the immediate threat, opened fire simultaneously, their bullets striking the Irish hitman multiple times and sending him crashing to the ground with severe wounds to his chest, arm, and leg. When the smoke cleared and the echoes of gunfire faded, Tony Brindle lay on the pavement bleeding profusely, but conscious and alive, paramedics rushing to provide emergency treatment. The would-be assassin lay nearby, critically injured and under immediate police guard, his assassination attempt having failed by the narrowest of margins. It emerged through subsequent investigation that this hitman was not a local thug or someone with ties to British gangs. He was an Irish mercenary with no previous connections to the Arif Brindle feud, a professional brought in from outside, specifically for this high-risk contract killing. His hiring hinted very strongly at Arif involvement, as it bore all the hallmarks of their strategic thinking, using complete outsiders to carry out hits, thus obscuring the trail of evidence and making it harder for police to establish conspiracy charges. Incredibly, both men survived that violent morning in Rotherhithe. Tony Brindle underwent emergency surgery to repair damage from the shotgun blast, and after weeks of recovery, pulled through, though reportedly he swore he would never again be caught off guard in such a manner. The Irish hitman also survived his multiple gunshot wounds and was taken into custody once medically stable, eventually facing a lengthy list of charges, including attempted murder, possession of firearms, and conspiracy. The incident caused significant embarrassment to the Metropolitan Police in some quarters. Tony Brindle had been under their protective surveillance and yet still ended up shot, but it also highlighted their determination and capability. They had anticipated the hit through good intelligence work, positioned themselves to intervene, and while they couldn't prevent Tony's injury entirely, they did prevent his murder and captured the triggerman alive, thus likely averting a fresh wave of retaliation killings that would certainly have followed if Tony Brindle had died that day. After the Rotherhithe shooting, even the most stubborn and violence-prone figures on both sides had to reckon with an uncomfortable reality. The feud that had started 5 years earlier in 1990 had nearly cost Tony Brindle his life, despite heavy police surveillance, and it had already claimed multiple lives on both sides. The Arifs, by now significantly diminished in strength due to arrests and long prison sentences, had nevertheless demonstrated they were still willing and able to strike with lethal intent, importing professional killers if necessary. But continuing this war indefinitely promised only mutual destruction, more deaths, more lengthy prison sentences, more resources wasted on violence rather than profit-generating criminal activity. By the late 1990s, an extraordinary development finally put the feud to rest in a manner almost no one could have predicted. Not a ceasefire negotiated at gunpoint in some neutral meeting place, but rather a union at the altar that seemed almost Shakespearean in its irony and its effectiveness at ending bloodshed. In a twist that surprised both law enforcement observers and underworld figures alike, a member of the Brindle clan and a member of the Arif clan fell in love and decided to marry despite the bloody history between their families. Johnny Brindle, a relative of Tony Brindle with connections throughout the Brindle criminal network, wed a young woman named Debbie Arif, creating a direct familial link between two families that had been dedicated to spilling each other's blood for years. This marriage created an entirely new dynamic that made continued violence untenable. With kinship now linking the families through marriage, neither the Brindles nor the Arifs could realistically continue to target the other without potentially harming their own extended family members or creating impossible conflicts of loyalty. Sources close to the underworld, speaking to journalists and police years later, indicated that this marriage, more than any police crackdown or truce negotiation, effectively ended the Arif-Dali-Brindle feud once and for all. The guns were finally silenced, and an uneasy but durable peace settled over South London's Gangland, allowing both families to refocus on their criminal enterprises without the constant fear of assassination. Even as the gang feud was winding down through the mid-1990s, law enforcement agencies were pursuing a parallel mission that would prove ultimately more successful than any intervention in the gang war. The systematic destruction of the Arif crime family is criminal empire itself through arrests, prosecutions, and lengthy prison sentences. The dramatic events of November 1990 in Reigate, Surrey, had been the first major strike in this campaign. Following the botched Securicor robbery attempt, where Kenneth Baker was killed and Mehmet and Dennis Arif were captured by waiting police, prosecutors worked to ensure these two operational leaders would not see freedom for a very long time. In 1991, they were both convicted on multiple serious charges, including armed robbery, possession of illegal firearms, and attempted murder for the shots fired at police officers during their attempted escape. Dennis Arif received a sentence of 22 years imprisonment, and Mehmet Arif was handed 18 years. These stiff sentences effectively removed two of the family's most active and capable members from the streets, during what should have been their most productive criminal years, and the convictions sent a clear, unmistakable message to their remaining brothers. The authorities were closing in methodically, and the days of operating with impunity were ending. With two of the gang's key operational commanders taken out of action and locked away, police and prosecutors turned up the investigative heat significantly on the remaining Arif brothers, who were still at large. Dogan Arif, widely considered the godfather and most feared member of the family, due to his reputation for extreme personal violence and his suspected role in overseeing much of the family's drug trafficking operations, became a prime target for law enforcement. His penchant for brutal intimidation was well documented in police files, and investigators believed he was the strategic mind behind the family's expansion into large-scale heroin importation. It wasn't long before Dogan too fell into the legal dragnet that was systematically dismantling his family's empire. Through the combined efforts of the Metropolitan Police's organized crime units and HM Customs investigators who specialized in drug smuggling cases, Dogan was implicated in a massive heroin smuggling scheme involving multiple shipments from Turkey. This coordination meant that whether the Arifs tried to relocate operations to another city, diversify into new types of crime, or establish new networks, multiple law enforcement agencies would be sharing data in real time and watching for patterns. The investigative noose was tightening from all sides, making it increasingly difficult for the remaining Arif brothers to operate without detection. Even as these major family figures were systematically removed from the streets and locked away, one absolutely key figure still eluded capture and continued operating: Bekir Arif, known within the family and the underworld as the Duke. After finishing his 5-year prison stint for his role in the 1977 security van robbery, where a guard was killed, Bekir had remained deeply involved in the family business, but had evolved his approach significantly. By the 1990s, investigators and informants believed it was Bekir who managed the strategic aspects of the Arif's drug empire behind the scenes, operating more like a corporate executive than a street gangster. While Dogan and other brothers dealt with street-level enforcement collections and the occasional necessity of violence to maintain control, Bekir focused on maintaining the international connections that kept heroin flowing into Britain and on handling the complex financial side of the criminal enterprise, laundering money, managing investments, and ensuring cash flow. He was extremely careful in his operations, more businessman than traditional gangster in his methods and demeanor. He maintained a deliberately low profile, rarely if ever handling drugs or firearms directly, thus staying several steps removed from the physical evidence trail that had ensnared his brothers. He used intermediaries, conducted business through coded conversations, and avoided creating the kind of direct evidence that prosecutors could use in court. Throughout the mid-1990s, despite the best efforts of multiple police units, Bekir remained frustratingly elusive, even as surveillance teams tracked him, and informant reports suggested he was orchestrating major drug deals. The National Crime Squad, recognizing him as perhaps the most dangerous remaining Arif because of his intelligence and caution, launched an extensive undercover operation specifically targeting him. After months of patient, painstaking investigative work involving physical surveillance, electronic monitoring, and cultivation of sources within the Turkish-Cypriot community, they finally caught a significant break. In late 1997, investigators intercepted communications revealing plans for an exceptionally large heroin transaction involving Bekir and overseas suppliers, a deal that would involve quantities far exceeding anything in his previous criminal record. Over subsequent months, investigative teams meticulously tailed meetings between Bekir and suspected drug traffickers, tapped phone lines after obtaining proper judicial warrants, and amassed hundreds of hours of recordings and surveillance footage documenting the conspiracy as it unfolded. The evidence they compiled painted a damning and comprehensive picture. Bekir Arif, personally negotiating the importation of 100 kilograms of heroin, discussing in detail the logistics of transportation routes through multiple countries, debating pricing with suppliers, and planning distribution networks within Britain, all conducted with an air of complete impunity, as if he believed himself untouchable. In early 1998, after investigators were confident they had sufficient evidence to secure a conviction, the trap was decisively sprung. Bekir Arif and several close associates were arrested simultaneously in a carefully coordinated sweep designed to prevent any of them from fleeing or destroying evidence. At his subsequent trial at the Old Bailey in 1999, Bekir, then in his mid-40s and facing the prospect of spending the rest of his productive life in prison, attempted to mount a defense that portrayed him as bewildered and essentially innocent. He even made the somewhat absurd comparison of himself to Del Boy, the lovable rogue from the popular British television comedy Only Fools and Horses, claiming implausibly that he had stumbled unwittingly into a criminal conspiracy without understanding what he was involved in. But the jury, after hearing hours of wiretap recordings in Bekir's own voice, discussing drug quantities, prices, and logistics, and after reviewing surveillance footage showing his meetings with known drug traffickers, saw through this performance entirely. He was convicted of conspiracy to supply 100 kilograms of heroin, a quantity with an estimated street value of $12.5 million, and was sentenced to 23 years in prison, one of the longest sentences handed down in a British drug case at that time. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, lambasted Bekir's cynicism and complete lack of remorse, noting pointedly that there was not a shred of mitigation in his crimes, no suggestion that he had been coerced, no evidence of rehabilitation, nothing that would justify leniency. For the Arif family as a criminal organization, Bekir's downfall was perhaps the most devastating blow yet. He was now the third Arif brother to receive a massive prison term during the 1990s, and he had been the strategic brain behind their most lucrative operations. With him locked away, the family's ability to function as a cohesive criminal enterprise was essentially destroyed. The story might have ended there with Bekir serving his sentence, but it didn't, because even decades later, the Duke would demonstrate that old habits die extremely hard. In 2013, Britain's serious organised crime agency, known as SOCIA, which had replaced earlier organisations like NCIS, compiled an updated assessment of the country's most dangerous organised crime figures. In that assessment, despite having spent years in prison, Bekir Arif was still ranked among Britain's most toxic and dangerous crime bosses, a designation indicating that law enforcement agencies continued to view him as a serious ongoing threat, even in custody. That assessment, which some might have dismissed as overly cautious, proved remarkably prescient. In July 2015, more than 15 years after his original conviction, police acting on fresh intelligence raided a remote caravan site in Somerset, far from Bekir's traditional London territory. Inside one of the caravans, officers discovered approximately 48 kilograms of high-purity amphetamine, a huge cache of stimulant drugs with a street value in the millions, all carefully packaged and clearly destined for distribution networks. The subsequent investigation, involving analysis of communications and financial records, traced the operation directly back to Bekir Arif. Even as a supposedly closely monitored ex-convict, now in his 60s, and theoretically under restrictions designed to prevent exactly this kind of activity, Bekir had been covertly orchestrating yet another significant narcotics enterprise from the shadows, using intermediaries and careful operational security in an attempt to avoid detection. He was duly arrested once again, and in March 2016, he stood in court facing new charges. This time, prosecutors presented evidence not only of his role in conspiring to supply amphetamines, but also of his brazen breach of a serious crime prevention order that had been specifically designed to monitor and curtail his activities following his previous release. The judge, clearly exasperated by Bekir's complete inability or unwillingness to reform, handed down an additional sentence of 11.5 years imprisonment. It appeared that nothing short of permanent incarceration could keep the Duke from returning to his criminal ways, a testament to both his determination and his inability to function in legitimate society. By the time of Bekir's final conviction in 2016, the Arif family as a dominant, cohesive force in British organised crime had been comprehensively dismantled. The criminal empire they had built so ruthlessly through the 1970s and 1980s, reaching its zenith of power and wealth in the late 1980s, had not survived the sustained law enforcement onslaught of the 1990s and 2000s intact. Many of the brothers spent the prime years of their lives and beyond incarcerated in high-security prisons across Britain, separated from each other and from their criminal networks. Those who eventually emerged from prison after serving substantial portions of their sentences did so as older men, their territories long since absorbed by rival organizations. Their former associates scattered or imprisoned themselves, and the entire criminal landscape of London transformed almost beyond recognition from what they had known. There was simply no organizational slot for the aging Arifs to slip back into upon release. Other gangs, often from newer immigrant communities, with their own ethnic networks and international connections, had filled the void left by the Arifs' imprisonment, and the methods of modern organized crime had evolved significantly with new technologies and new markets. Yet, even as the Arif family's reign was definitively broken, not all traces of their influence disappeared entirely from South London's underworld. The family had always been large and extended, with dozens of associates, cousins, and more distant relatives who had been involved at various operational levels over the decades. In the 2000s and 2010s, there were occasional murmurs in underworld circles and in police intelligence reports that some relatively low-key drug operations, fraud schemes, or other criminal activities still had Arif fingerprints on them in some capacity, perhaps run by younger relatives trading on the family name, perhaps involving former associates trying to maintain some continuity. These operations were never large enough or brazen enough to attract the kind of newspaper headlines or concentrated police attention that the family's activities had drawn in earlier decades. But they hinted that the Arif legacy lived on in some diminished shape or form, like embers that occasionally flare but never reignite the full blaze. Law enforcement agencies, for their part, remained vigilant regarding anything connected to the Arif name. Whenever one of the Arif brothers was released from prison after serving his sentence, specialized surveillance teams made note of his movements and associations, watching for any signs that he might attempt to rebuild criminal operations. Any time a major law enforcement operation involved Turkish-Cypriot criminals in South London, which remained a demographic present in the area, one of the questions routinely asked in intelligence briefings was whether the activity might tie back somehow to the Arifs or their extended network. For the most part, those concerns did not materialize into significant new criminal enterprises. The old lions had been definitively caged, their power broken, and the younger generation, whether through choice or pragmatism, seemed largely disinclined to attempt wearing the crown of criminal infamy that had brought their elders only violence and imprisonment. The neighborhoods and streets that the Arifs once dominated through fear and violence, areas like Peckham, Walworth, Rotherhithe, and Camberwell, gradually grew calmer and in many respects safer over the years following the family's downfall. Community investment, changing demographics, and sustained police attention all contributed to reducing violent crime rates. New businesses opened in areas that had once been considered too dangerous for legitimate investment. New waves of immigrants arrived and built their lives and livelihoods, contributing to the economic and cultural fabric of South London. A sense of normality gradually returned to communities that had lived for years under the shadow of gang violence and protection rackets. But people who lived through the Arif era, particularly those who were adults during the 1980s and early 1990s, did not forget what that time was like. Among older South Londoners, particularly those with connections to small businesses or the nightlife industry, the Arif family's name still invokes an involuntary shiver of remembered fear. There are pub owners and shopkeepers who can vividly recall the ritual of handing over envelopes stuffed with cash every month as protection payments, never quite sure what they were being protected from except the enforcers themselves. There are former nightclub bouncers and security personnel who remember seeing the Arif brothers or their enforcers looming in doorways, their mere presence ensuring that the night's trade and any disputes would go exactly the way the family wanted. These memories, passed down in quiet conversations and sometimes to younger family members as cautionary tales, ensure that the Arif spectre still lingers in collective memory, even if the men themselves are gone, imprisoned, or aged into irrelevance. Today, decades after their peak of power, the Arifs have secured a place in London's extensive criminal folklore. They are mentioned routinely in the same breath as the Cray twins, the Richardson gang, and the Addams family when people discuss, write about, or make documentaries about the capital's historic crime families and the dark history of organized crime in Britain. But unlike the Cray twins, who somehow became pop-cultural anti-heroes with films, books, and even a certain twisted glamour attached to their memory, the Arifs never attained that kind of romanticized gloss. They remained throughout their reign and in subsequent memory as dark, genuinely frightening figures, more feared than admired, their violence too real and too recent for nostalgia. Their story is recounted in true crime documentaries and investigative books, not with the kind of perverse nostalgia that sometimes attaches to historical criminals, but rather with a kind of grim clinical appreciation for the scale of their criminal enterprise and the extent of their eventual downfall. Walk into certain South London cafes or social clubs on a quiet afternoon, particularly those frequented by older members of the Turkish-Cypriot community, and you might find a few grey-haired gentlemen sitting over coffee or tea, reminiscing in a mixture of Turkish and English about the old days. Listen carefully without drawing attention, and perhaps you'll catch a reference to Dogan or the Duke, spoken in tones that mix respect, fear, and sometimes a kind of weary resignation. These murmured conversations, conducted with an awareness that some things are better left unspoken in detail, are the living echoes of the Arif legacy. For the most part, the participants in these conversations are not eager to broadcast what they know to outsiders or authorities. They lived through genuinely dangerous times, when speaking carelessly could result in a violent visit from enforcers, and old habits of cautious silence die hard even decades later. Still, in those carefully guarded recollections shared among those who were there, the legend of the Arif Crime Family endures, passed on like a cautionary tale to younger people willing to listen about what organized crime really looks like and where it ultimately leads. The Arif Crime Family's complete trajectory, from ambitious immigrants seeking opportunity in 1960s London to the absolute pinnacle of Britain's criminal underworld by the late 1980s to their systematic destruction through the 1990s and beyond, offers a deeply sobering and instructive lesson about the true nature of organized crime. It powerfully underscores how a potent combination of ambition, family cohesion, ruthless violence, and opportunistic timing allowed a group of brothers to rise from a South London council estate to control vast criminal enterprises worth tens of millions of pounds. Simultaneously, their story demonstrates with equal clarity how that same ruthlessness and violence inevitably invited equally unyielding responses from multiple directions. Rival gangs determined to challenge their dominance and willing to kill to do so. And law enforcement agencies that eventually devoted entire specialized task forces and years of investigative resources to bringing them down systematically. The family's rise was meteoric, and their power at its peak seemed nearly unshakable, but their fall, though it took years to fully accomplish, was ultimately inevitable given the forces arrayed against them. For British law enforcement, the prolonged battle against the Arifs proved to be a formative experience that shaped modern approaches to combating organized crime. Police had to innovate significantly and learn painful lessons, including the necessity of coordinating effectively across different jurisdictions and agencies, employing sophisticated long-term surveillance operations rather than reactive investigations, and cultivating informants within closed ethnic communities that had previously been impenetrable. They had to learn from operational mistakes, such as underestimating how far criminal families would go to protect their interests, or how thoroughly fear would stifle potential witnesses, and adapt new strategies and legal tools to counter what was effectively a new breed of criminal organization, one that combined traditional territorial gang tactics with modern international drug trafficking networks. In many tangible ways, the enormous effort required to investigate, prosecute, and ultimately stop the Arifs helped fundamentally modernize British policing of organized crime. It directly spurred the creation of centralized intelligence units like the National Criminal Intelligence Service that could track criminals across the entire country. It fostered new forms of international law enforcement cooperation, recognizing that drugs, weapons, and money flow across borders and thus require coordinated multinational responses. The Arif case studies became training material for detectives, demonstrating both successful tactics and cautionary examples of what not to do. In some important respects, the Arif saga also marked the symbolic end of a particular era in British criminal history. As their family organization was systematically brought low through arrests and prosecutions, London's underworld landscape shifted fundamentally. The age of tight-knit, primarily domestic crime families operating along traditional lines, controlling defined territories, running protection rackets, organizing armed robberies, gradually gave way to a new epoch of more fluid international criminal networks and transient gang alliances, often organized along newer immigrant community lines. These newer organizations operated differently, with less territorial fixation and more focus on international drug trafficking, human smuggling, cybercrime, and money laundering through increasingly sophisticated financial mechanisms. Few criminal organizations since the Arif's fall have achieved the kind of localized infamy, multi-generational cohesion, and sustained operational success that characterized the Arif family at their peak. Their story remains in many ways a stark bookend to the history of London's traditional crime families, a final, extremely violent flourish of the old model before the underworld transformed its shape and methods for the new millennium. In the final analysis, what remains most tangibly of the Arif crime family are the stories told about them and the literal scars they left on their community. An entire generation of metropolitan police detectives cut their professional teeth pursuing the Arifs through the 1980s and 1990s, and many of those officers have since retired and written memoirs or given interviews, their recollections adding substantially to the historical record of just how formidable and dangerous the family once was. The communities that lived directly in the shadow of the Arif's reign for those years have largely moved on with their lives, but older residents, when asked, can still point out with precision the physical sites of key violent events that marked the era. That's where the William Hill betting shop was, where Abi Abdullah was killed in broad daylight, someone might say, pointing to what is now a different business entirely. And here, just around this corner, used to stand the Bell pub, scene of David Brindle's murder and that terrible night when an innocent man died too. These everyday locations, now housing mobile phone shops, cafes, apartments, are part of the normal urban landscape that thousands of people pass through daily without a second thought. But they are also quiet, unmarked monuments to an extremely bloody chapter in London's history. Places where the violence of organized crime erupted into public view with fatal consequences. And so, the tale of the Arif crime family concludes its active chapter as one significant thread in London's ever-evolving underworld narrative, a narrative that stretches back centuries and continues today in different forms. From genuinely humble beginnings as the children of Turkish-Cypriot immigrants trying to make their way in a foreign land, to reaching a notorious peak as perhaps Britain's most feared crime family, controlling vast criminal enterprises, to ultimately suffering a hard, inexorable fall under the combined weight of gang warfare and systematic law enforcement action. The Arifs embodied both the dark possibilities and the inevitable perils of choosing organized crime as a path. They built their empire methodically, through a combination of cunning strategy and shocking cruelty, and they saw it crumble decisively under the twin pressures of violent vengeance from rivals and the grinding wheels of justice. Their family name, once powerful enough in South London's underworld to make even hardened criminals think twice before crossing them, has now receded substantially into the historical annals of British crime, studied by criminologists and true crime enthusiasts, but no longer carrying active power in the streets. Yet its echo persists in collective memory and in cautionary tales, a stark reminder that for a significant period during the 1980s and early 1990s, in the back streets, council estates, pubs and nightclubs of South London, a criminal empire ruled by a close-knit family of brothers cast a long, terrifying shadow over entire communities, extorting businesses, trafficking deadly drugs, and perpetrating shocking violence, until inevitably, inexorably, the light of law enforcement attention caught up with them and brought that dark reign to its necessary end.